America has always had a race problem, whether it was with the Indians or whether it was African Americans.
When your country tells you you don't belong, it's not a concentration camp in the sense of that we think of as Auschwitz. There was not a plan to exterminate these people, but certainly they were rounded up because of their race and because they were physically different and because we were afraid of them.
The war came along and so we lost it all.
This was an extreme moment of injustice in American history, and the pain of it continues.
What happened to us was a mass hate crime. Shouldn't have happened.
The men and the women who were affected by this carry the betrayal of their country basically turning its back on them.
This government took away our innocence. I mean, as a young kid, we learned that freedom and justice for all meant freedom and justice for some. Not all. We were basically second-class citizens.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you.
I think my father went to market, 3 times a week. And in California, all your crops, like tomatoes and things, you pick them when there's just a little tinge of white, because that was all being shipped.
My dad bought this bare land. He planted peaches and walnuts. And then while those trees were growing up, he planted vegetables. And so we were small truck farmers. And then just as we were to harvest our first good crop of peaches, the war came along.
So the driving factor that really spurred internment was Pearl Harbor, the attack of the Japanese Empire on the United States. This surprise attack angered a lot of Americans, and they were looking for somebody to scapegoat, somebody to blame for this.
When Pearl Harbor happens and it's bombed, it's as if the Japanese in the US had done it. And people had a really hard time distinguishing between Japanese nationals and these Japanese Americans who had chosen to be here, and many of them who hadn't chosen to be here because 2/3 of them were American citizens.
I was born in California. So were all my brothers and sisters. My father came to the United States in 1906, and then my mother came in 1917.
I was 12 years old, and I was over at a neighbor's farm because I was picking yellow delicious. I was all by myself. My father came by and picked me up. And that's when he heard that Pearl Harbor, had happened. Well, of course, we didn't know what to expect,
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores.
The Pacific Coast had been a site of anti-Asian sentiment for a very long time. You have the Chinese Exclusion Act, you have various property acts that involve people of Asian descent not being able to own property, not being able to become American citizens. So I always feel like this history needs to start earlier when we understand that there is this discomfort with Asian immigrants of all stripes coming to the U.S.
The Japanese were identified as a potential security threat on the West Coast because nobody was quite sure whether they were loyal to the United States or to the Empire of Japan. A lot of that had to do with a lot of pre-war racism, the feeling that the Japanese had never felt welcome in places like California or Oregon or Washington, and the wartime hysteria allowed Californians to push for the expulsion of the Japanese.
We had always been like everybody else, a regular American citizen, saluted the flags, said, all the things,
Patriotism and loyalty. This is the only country we have. Born and raised here, taught all the songs, celebrated 4th of July. I mean, what other country could we be loyal to?
They wanted them out of there. They did not want to have to live next to them. And it wasn't just one person's idea. That fear, that hysteria sort of grew like a cancer across the land.
First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Now, here at San Francisco, for example, convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained.
Chief Justice Warren essentially took the position, if they haven't done anything yet, it's because they're waiting for a time when they can do it. They can do espionage, they can do sabotage. They are force ready to spring into action when they were given the word.
And Pearl Harbor focused that anti-Japanese hysteria and led the United States down a pretty dark road. Executive Order 9066 allowed the military leadership to declare a zone, an emergency zone, on the West Coast in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, in which they could relocate any of the civilian population they deemed as a security threat.
It didn't specifically say that all the Japanese had to be rounded up and moved to camps. It was very vague in that sense, and it was literally turned over to the military to implement. But before its final date was set, Japanese Americans were free to move out of the area, West Coast area, all the way from California up through Oregon and Washington, free to move to the interior of the United States. And after that date, they were not permitted to leave.
Well, these were the orders that were posted to tell us that we had a week to get rid of all of our property and belongings and report to a station, and we would be put on a train. And They didn't even tell us where we were going. And the interesting thing about this is that nowhere in the document is the word citizen. We were called non-aliens.
Essentially, if the Army says we can kick you out, we can kick you out. And so they draw a line basically through Washington, Oregon, California, and down into Arizona, and all the Japanese and Japanese Americans who live there are going to have to leave.
They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
Ralph Carr was the governor of Colorado at the beginning of World War II. And when he found out about the relocation, he said to Japanese Americans living on the West Coast that they could come to Colorado and live here freely, and that they would be welcomed into the Colorado community.
The citizens of Colorado, by and large, were opposed to the Japanese coming into the state. Many of the Coloradans had the same fears as Californians about the loyalty of the Japanese. They were afraid that the Japanese would come in and they would spy on Americans, they would sabotage the produce, they would, one person said, bringing the Japs, as they used, the term they used, bringing the Japs here is a knife in the back of good, loyal Coloradans.
They create these 10 concentration camps for them to be housed in during the war. You have 2 in Arizona, which are Poston and Gila River. We have the 2 in Arkansas, Rower and Jerome. So we have 2 in California. They are Manzanar and Tule Lake. You've got Amache or Amache, depending on who you talk to, here in Colorado. You've got Minidoka in Idaho. You've got Topaz in Utah. And then we have Heart Mountain in Wyoming.
Well, the fact that there was a camp in southeastern Colorado is one of the great ironies and contradictions of the time. So you have Governor Carr issuing his welcome to Japanese Americans to come to Colorado, and at the same time you have a relocation camp. And in fact, you had family members, members of the same family, some of whom were living free outside of the camp in Colorado, and others who were interned in the camp.
When we found out we were coming to Colorado, I only knew it was a square state. And we thought that there were Indians, selling blankets, to give you an idea how ignorant we were.
I had just turned 12. My birthday was May 15th. So it was time to leave, and I wasn't really prepared.
Imagine if you were a teenager from Los Angeles, you were born in the United States, you'd never been to Japan, you spoke English, you were an average, ordinary American. Suddenly you found yourself transplanted out into southeastern Colorado. You were given 1 week to pack up all of your worldly goods. You could bring 2 suitcases, no more. Simple everyday items like cameras and radios were forbidden.
I had some rabbits. I just opened the door and let them out loose. Of course, I had to leave my bicycle and some other things behind, baseball mitt. I mean, we had a lot of things we wanted to bring, but we were limited, and that's what we had.
Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. Now, this aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees.
There was a high school teacher at Yuba City High, and he offered to look over the property, so to speak. He preferred a lease. Of course, we didn't know much about property and leases and things. And, you sign because, the person is a school teacher, and you made so much money from the first crop of teachers. And it was like a lease with option to buy type of thing. he exercised that, and so we lost everything.
If the Japanese citizens did not report to the internment camps, they could be charged with federal charges. And there were a number of cases where Japanese conscientious objectors stood up and said, I'm not going to the camp, and they were prosecuted in federal court, and many of them served prison time. So the alternative was to go to an actual jail or go to this military barracks behind barbed wire with guard towers, with machine guns. You were not allowed to enter or leave without permission or a pass. At night, searchlights passed back and forth across your barracks. All of your meals were regulated, all of your work was regulated, and you were treated as somebody who was disloyal to your country.
You know, we constitute, what, 1/10 of 1% of the population in the United States. We're a very tiny minority group. So I guess that's part of the reason they were able to do what they did.
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort.
Well, you know, first of all, we went to a first camp, which was in California. There was this assembly center, which was in Merced.
It resembled a prison camp in the sense that it was surrounded by barbed wire, and they had very hastily built barracks in the center part of the fairground racetrack. And fortunately, we ended up in some barracks, but there were other people who lived in horse stalls for the races, horse races. And we lived there for three months, and then we were put on trains and taken to Amache.
Well, when we took this train trip, we were on a converted coal train. We were on the train for 3.5, days. And we arrived at night. And the name of the town, I understand now that's pronounced Grenada, but we always pronounced it Granada, being from California. And the following morning was the first time, of course, that we saw what that whole area looked like. Needless to say, coming from California, it was a real big shock to see this nothingness. I shall never forget. And I thought, what? Nothing? Nothing? I don't see any trees. I don't see anything, all this very desolate looking area,
One of the things that is important for people to understand is that it's an absolutely instant city, and it's the 10th largest city during the war in Colorado. So it kind of grows up overnight, and it is in the high plains. And the War Relocation Authority came in and they just scraped it bare. So you can just imagine this blowing sand. And this is something that people recall when they talk about Amache. They remember the sand, they remember the wind, they remember that it's just always gritty.
Amache was galaxies away from anything that they had experienced before. Imagine essentially a windblown desert in southeastern Colorado. This is a part of the country that had just gone through the Dust Bowl.
We're only 10 miles from Kansas. So this is not Rocky Mountain, Colorado. This is, it is dry, it is hot.
It was very hot in summer and very cold in the winter. And we weren't prepared for that. I mean, because we didn't know where we were going when we left.
And for these Angelinos, these city dwellers, to move by train out into a camp that wasn't even completed at the beginning of the war, and with the dust and the yuccas and the rattlesnakes, they looked around and they said, my God, how can people live here?
First of all, when the first trains arrived, the camp hadn't yet been completed. Eventually they had sawmills out there, but early on they started the construction from the town and it was easy to see what was happening. This community consisted of only 400 people.
Grenada was a small farming town. It was mostly a sugar beet growing town. And the people were, like most Coloradans, pretty opposed to the idea of bringing Japanese in. They were suspicious that the Japanese were disloyal or would sabotage the produce or otherwise cause problems.
You've got some of the residents here that were fearful. They didn't know what to expect. We have business owners like Mr. Newman, his drugstore, and several other businesses. They welcomed the Japanese Americans, and coming out of the Depression and Dust Bowl, they averted to bankruptcy because of the money that they brought in. So they were, I would say, more than enthusiastic that they were actually here.
In one sense, the people down there didn't know there was a depression. They were depressed long before it even started. And so to see any sort of economic improvement occurring was a welcome idea.
The relationship between the townspeople in Grenada and the Japanese at Amache was a complicated one. In many ways, they helped each other. And it certainly, as the war went on and the suspicion of this population declined, there was more back and forth, more socialization between the Japanese and the townspeople in Grenada.
And then you have the farmers that lost land, condemned. They lost condemned land to Amache. Almost 14,000 acres that will be taken away from local farmers and landowners. There's no animosity towards Japanese Americans. In fact, they made friends, great friends with Japanese Americans. They understand that that was not their fault.
So the conditions were rather primitive. And it was the lack of privacy and the dirt and the dust. And
the living quarters for the Japanese at Amache were pretty Spartan. They were military-style barracks, which had 5 or 6 apartments. Each apartment would have a family of anywhere between 3 and 7 and sometimes 9 people, multi-generations living in not only in one apartment, but in one room. There were no partitions except for the improvised partitions of bed sheets that were placed across spaces to create a little bit of privacy.
You have a bare bulb, you've got a potbelly stove, and you've got metal cots that have been given to you by the Army. That is it. You do not have any place to put your clothes, you do not have a desk, you do not have a table. All of that stuff the internees had to provide for themselves, and they built them out of scrap and shipping crates and whatever they could scramble together.
we weren't supposed to take the scrap lumber, but we did some midnight requisition, made our own furniture, very crude.
They also have no running water in their apartment themselves, or I should call it a living unit. The War Relocation Authority called them apartments, but that's definitely a euphemism in terms of what was available to you.
Denver Post, at that time it wasn't under Palmer Hoyt. They were very, very, I think they put out an article one time that our sewage system, whatever it was, that tank thing, that we had a swimming pool there, yeah.
We had no kitchen or anything. They had a mess hall. So with about 250 people living in a block, we had to go in 2 shifts. You would line up in long lines, and you were given a tray when you walked in, walk along, and they would just throw the food on. There was no choice in terms of food. I mean, you took what was dished out, get some strange foods that we had never seen before, liver and onions, for example, chicken gizzards, But if you didn't eat, you can go home go back to your barrack or room, and there was no refrigerator or anything like that, so just went hungry. And then if you needed to go to the bathroom, they had a communal bathroom. But even there was no privacy. I mean, the toilet facilities were just a bunch of stools with no partitions or anything.
They were trying to essentially warehouse these people at the most minimal of costs.
They made a rough beginning at self-government, for while the Army would guard the outer limits of each area, community life and security within were largely up to the Japanese themselves. They immediately saw the need for developing civic leaders. At weekly community meetings, citations were given to the block leaders who had worked most diligently.
So ironically enough, the United States government felt that it was imperative to teach these loyal American citizens of the value of self-government and democracy. Each block elected representatives that served on essentially a town council. And so the civilian affairs of the camp were governed by the Japanese internees themselves. There was a civilian police force, there was a fire department. It was every town USA, except that there were machine guns trained on you.
It's not so bad until you think about being a mother and looking up at that tower and your children are playing and there's a guy there with a sharpshooter rifle. Maybe when you're 5 years old, after a while you don't see that person in that tower anymore, but I bet your mom does. And certainly some internees really talk about how much that was frightening to them, that there was somebody up there, you know, kind of looking at them at all the time. And that loss of freedom, you know, here they are, 2/3 of them are American citizens, and particularly the older of those, they're well aware of what's going on to them.
Every morning, we'd pledge our allegiance to the flag, and we, of course, ended up with liberty and justice for all. And, you know, we got so we would almost shout out the words justice, freedom, and justice for all, because we knew we were behind barbed wires. We knew we were under guard. I mean, MPs were always there.
One middle schooler named Tom Shikaguni wrote an essay that was critical of conscription for the Japanese Americans. And his teacher asked him to talk about the paper after class, and he said, I don't believe that the government should conscript Japanese Americans until they return us to America. The teacher replied in saying, well, you know, we're keeping you here for your protection. There are people outside of the fence who want to hurt you. And his response was, then why are you pointing the machine guns inside?
So many tragic stories of families being separated. There's one grave there of a baby. The baby passed away on Christmas Day. It was 2 years ago we got an email from the younger brother of that baby. Of course, the brother wasn't born yet, but their parents had a strawberry farm outside of Los Angeles. Mother was carrying this baby, and the stress that she was put under, and the train ride that she was put under. Baby was born premature and lived, I think, maybe 3 months. But to this day, the family contributes that death to that stress, that train ride.
A number of people died in Amache. It was open for 4 years. There was a hospital on the camp, but the regular course of life continued. There were births, marriages, deaths. All of the things that you would normally have, all of the passages that you would normally have in your life took place in Amache. They just happened to take place behind barbed wire.
The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army.
It's a very meager existence in terms of what they came to. Now, what they were able to do with that, again, is amazing to me, and how immediately they're organizing sewing clubs and artist guilds and photography groups, and they're doing kabuki theater, and they're learning traditional dance, and they make a sumo ring, and they recreate a town and really take that. So the things that were really livable about camp were the things that they made, the things that they did.
The only main difference was the fact that you were in camp, you could not leave. But they did have a lot of activities, you know. I know that whatever activity they had, our father always encouraged us to join everything there was, you know. And we joined everything that they had to offer.
In Amache, they finally started something called a co-op. It was a place where people could could go and buy items. Actually, there were 3 barracks that were put together, and that became the co-op stores, so to speak. It had shoe repair shop and jewelry repair and, you know, a few other things like that. In fact, you could even buy some canned goods, and that's how people sort of supplemented their food from the mess halls. And, you know, some people from Grenada would even come in and buy shoes and things like that because they didn't have a shoe store in Grenada.
They begin to transform the environment. And to me, that's one of the most powerful things that I see out there is how radically they took this landscape that they did not choose to live in and make it someplace more beautiful at like every single scale you can imagine. So within their own barracks, they are painting them and they're making their own furniture and they're creating art to put on the walls. And then they are planting seeds, they're planting all sorts of plants and they're creating trees, they're making shade, they're building playgrounds for their children. The kids are making basketball courts, you know, out of lumber that they've scavenged. You know, that they took this place and instead of burning their barracks down because they were mad, they instead made it a more lovely place. And so it's a complex sort of history of both sort of tradition and change and pride in who they were as people of Japanese ancestry, but also pride of who they were as Americans.
All the teachers were really great. You know, all of them were very great. I mean, I cannot, you know, say anything bad about that. We had a lot of teachers who had retired. Everybody that came to teach there voluntarily came because they wanted to come, you know. Naturally, we had a good atmosphere because they all had that good attitude. But that didn't mean that they didn't expect us to do our very best.
There were some really interesting people in that camp. We had a professor from Stanford University, a guy named Yamado Ichihashi, one of the foremost intellectuals of his time. But in Amache, he taught some courses in Japanese culture, I think. We had, you know, like a Disney cartoonist, we had guys who worked in the aircraft industry in Los Angeles. We had doctors, dentists. They were only paid $19 a month. I mean, that's less than $1 a day. It was terrible.
Everything was provided for the Japanese in this camp. That was one of the ways that the government tried to sell the camp. Everything will be taken care of. We'll pay for your shelter. We'll pay for your food. You won't have to do dishes. You won't have to clean your bathroom. But of course, all of that had a corrosive effect on the family structure. It took away the responsibilities of women in the family. They didn't have to cook. They didn't have to clean. They didn't have to do anything. So they struggled with the sense of who they were in these camps.
There was patriotism there, but there was also a cultural respect for authority. Authority was something that was exercised in the family by the father, and that family authority broke down in the camps. And it broke down because all of a sudden the teenagers were eating over here and the parents were eating over here, and so that cohesiveness within the family broke down.
Many of them were separated because their father was considered a threat, so they were sent to more of a prison-style type of a camp.
There was this girl, and she was very bitter. I mean, bitter, 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 bitter. And so they said to her, "Why are you so bitter?" She said, "You would be bitter too if your father was in another camp." Her father was in a camp in Texas.
This one particular woman, she said, "Yeah, my grandfather was sent there." I said, "Well, so I got to ask, why was he deemed a threat?" And she goes, "Well, he fought in the Japanese army during the Russian-Japanese war." And I said, "Really? I mean, he had to be really old." "Yeah, he was 67 years old, he couldn't walk, and he was blind." And I said, And he was deemed a threat because he was in the military for the Japanese. He said yes. Another separation because the father was a Methodist minister and a dentist and was sent to Santa Fe as well. Massive heart attack while there. Daughter was 6 years old in this camp. When they brought him back because they couldn't do anything for him. The day he arrived in Amache was the day he died. She was 6 years old when that happened. How do you know, what do you say to a person like that? How do you make it better? You can't make it better. You just can't do that.
They're definitely under surveillance, but this is a time of extreme labor shortage, and these are people who know how to grow things. And so even before they get to the permanent internment camps, even when they're in the assembly centers, which are the sort of temporary places they're first sent to, they're already getting work permits to go out and do farm work because the farms need them.
I actually talked to one of the former MPs. He was telling me, he says, we manned the guard towers for a little while, but we didn't need to. And then he said that when they came out of the fields with their vegetables, they kept giving us vegetables, and we didn't want to turn them down. He says, so we kept taking in vegetables. Our guard towers were getting full of rotten vegetables because we couldn't eat them as much. So he said that was the best part of my stay in the military during World War II.
Early on, the camp was closely guarded by a detachment of military, Army people, but that was soon relinquished to civilian administrators, and it relaxed a little bit. In fact, when various agricultural seasons were on, many of the men in the camp would simply board trucks and go wherever they were needed. Many went 2 states over sometimes to work in various crops and so forth.
They're also getting permits to leave the camp to shop. So they're going into nearby Grenada. So one of the things that makes Amache different than the other 9 camps is that there's a town very nearby. And that town ends up with an interesting symbiotic relationship with the camp.
People could leave the camp, as they did, which was to our good fortune, and come into town and buy the things they needed. They could also place orders at Frank's fish and poultry market, and one of my little duties at night was to ride the tailgate of his pickup truck to the camp and make these deliveries to the people who had ordered chicken or fish or both during the day.
There are stores in Lamar that would say we don't serve Japs, and we don't, etc. Barbershop would put up a sign saying, well, we have a Jap hunting license, like that,
We would see signs, no Japs, and all that kind of stuff. You just turn a blind what's it. And later on, when we were in camp, other people had told us, don't go to this store, don't go to that store. We said, okay. Well, pretty soon the signs started coming down because now they had no business, right? But we had long memories, Nope, we're not going over there, we're not going over there, we're not going to say anything, but we're not going over there.
Our nearest movie theater was in Lamar, 17 miles west, the Pioneer Theater, and every week there was some sort of propaganda film, especially about the war in the Pacific. I remember those rather vividly. We never made the connection between those propaganda films and the people who were residing in this camp. It seemed like a totally different world, totally different people to us. As a result of that, I developed, I think, a healthy and lifelong skepticism about what our government tells us. I have such a reverence for the people in the town and the reverence for the people who live in that camp. I honor them, every day. And I do so because of what they gave me. And I'm sorry they don't know it.
And one of the things that's amazing about Amache is that it has the greatest number of all of the 10 internment camps, the highest percentage of people who enlist for the military. Over 10% of the people who passed through that camp went to war. And they went to war for the U.S., even though they themselves were imprisoned.
Between 600 and 900 who went, who either were volunteered or drafted or into the military from Amache, and many of them were killed. Bodies were brought back to Amache, and we had services for them behind barbed wires. You know, they were people who, some were killed in Italy, and some were killed in France, and there was one military unit that freed the prisoners in Dachau.
There was really important work to be done in languages. Everybody who spoke Japanese was in the camps. They needed those people.
My brother was one of the first, among the first group to volunteer, to leave Amache and go to join the Army. They sent him to what they call military intelligence because they wanted people who could speak Japanese. They served with all units there, Navy, Marines, Army. And that's a very little known story in our history books.
You also have women who shipped off and they were in the WACs and the waves. And you've got people, you know, kids who are wrapping bandages at the Red Cross. So we have this real involvement in that and a real sense of patriotism for so many of the young people in that camp who were ready to go out and prove what good Americans they were and prove their loyalty to this country.
There was a great deal of conflict going on within the families when their sons would say, you know, I'm going to join the military. There were people who said, you're crazy. Look around you. I mean, look what they've done to us. I know of one instance where the father disowned the son. And that boy was killed in France. He died. And much later on, after the camps, and they were released, and the fellow was living back in California, the father committed suicide. And I'm sure it's because he had disowned his son, and his son had been killed.
We arrived in Grenada approximately like August 1942, and then we left Camp Amache one day after VJ Day because they lifted all of the travel restrictions.
I was 12 when I went in. You know, I had just had my birthday. And I was 15 when I left. I left on the 1st of September 1945.
Those who remained behind by the end of the war had to leave because the camp closed down in October of 1945. And as early as August 1945, the federal government was saying, hey, you've got to find somewhere else to live. You can't stay here. We're not going to support this camp after the war. And so by the end of October, all of the Japanese had moved away, most back to their homes in California, and the camp was closed down.
They closed schools. And they closed the hospital, and they closed all kinds of things. They were closing the mess halls. They had told the people, you know, to leave, and we don't care where you go.
It was almost like the war is over, make your way home, or they provided trains for people to go back to California or wherever.
They were giving them $25 and a train ticket. If you're from California and you want to go back there, here's $25 and a train ticket. Some of the people who were who left were really eager to get back there, back to California. They wanted to go, you know, get back to their properties, and some lucked out. The first family who went back ran into unfortunate circumstances. They went back to Placer County and they found dynamite You know, someone tried to blast them out. I know of a couple of families who had stored things either in their garage or in someone else's garage, and they lost it because someone came along and burned the garage. There were other people who stored their items in Buddhist churches, for example, like in Los Angeles. And vandals got in there and stole things, and people simply wouldn't hire them, wouldn't rent to them. And you know, word like that gets back to the camp. And so a lot of people were apprehensive. He said they didn't want to leave the camp. A lot of people ended up in trailer camps, so-called trailer camps. And others ended up in like hostels, you know, churches. They were basically homeless.
Governor Carr's courageous efforts on behalf of the Japanese Americans cost him dearly in terms of his political career.
By the end of the war, Governor Carr was no longer governor of Colorado. In 1942, he attempted to run as the Republican candidate for the United States Senate, and he was defeated resoundingly because of his pro-Japanese stance.
He lost subsequent elections for the Senate, and he ultimately left politics. The lesson from someone like Ralph Carr is a simple one, and that is that you have to do the right thing. You have to respect other people. You have to be true to your heart, even when everyone around you is telling you that that's not the way to go. And even if you know that that truth may come at a great cost to yourself personally.
None of the Japanese or Japanese Americans in Amache were accused of a crime or convicted of a crime. Although they were suspected of disloyalty, there were no legal proceedings which had placed them in the internment camp at Amache. And in fact, there were no charges of disloyalty ever placed against any of the internees in any of the 10 camps.
If you're an American citizen, no matter what your ancestry is or what your nationality is, then the American Constitution should be for everybody. It's the way it was meant to be.
It is human nature to paint with a very broad brush, to assign characteristics based on very general, for very general reasons like the way that somebody looks or their sexuality. And that's why the Constitution is so important, because it's that document that guarantees all peoples those basic rights that we as Americans enjoy. Ultimately, the Supreme Court determined that the relocation was illegal because it deprived Japanese Americans of their property without appropriate process. And of course, we're aware that the Constitution guarantees due process to all Americans.
In the mid-1980s, the United States government apologized for internment and authorized reparations of $20,000 to anyone who was affected by internment. For many Japanese, this is still an open question, though, because it seemed that compared to the suffering and loss, the financial loss, the devastating financial loss, that the reparations were insufficient. So I think the debate still continues.
I'm about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors. Surviving Japanese Americans of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
The monies actually didn't come through until the Bush administration. It was what, it was almost 2000. I wish it had gone to my parents. They worked all their lives hard work.
We found out a lot about the Japanese Americans and came to admire them enormously for who they were and what they were doing and how they were taking it and so forth. It was a real lesson for me. I'm eternally grateful to those wonderful people for so many things, because these people, these Japanese Americans, had given up so much, and in their doing so moved to a godforsaken piece of real estate and made our lives so much better that they created options for us. I don't think my brother and I would ever had the means to go to college if it hadn't been for that opportunity. So I am grateful to them. They're in my memory every day.
Everything from the camp has been removed completely, because I think everyone wanted it to be like, this never happened, America's the same, no blemish there.
The Grenadans really wanted to forget all about Amache. They decided that this was not something to be proud of at the end of the day. And it took a young generation of high school students from Grenada, from today's Grenada, to remind their parents and grandparents that this was really a national story. This story had transcendent importance. And it's those high school students today who are really preserving the memory of this community.
I think it's important that we remember this. Make sure that people actually know what happened back in the past so that we don't do it again.
I don't think you go to Amache and you're not moved by it, whether it's sort of the kind of ghosts that are there now with this sort of empty space that has remained empty. To me, what we're finding is really important, but it's also the process is really important, because we're building community and a place where we can talk about the issues that are underneath all of this, which is who belongs in America, and what do we do when we're scared, and what a dangerous mix it is to have, you know, sort of racism be thrown in with hysteria. No good ever comes of that.
It could happen again, and it could happen in different ways. It could happen to different groups of people. Prejudice is an ugly thing, and it rears its head all the time in this country.
This is an issue that America has not really resolved.
I think I got more upset with people not knowing what happened more than anything else. That's part of history, and I think it's important that you do remember that, just like with the Native Americans, you know, the Trail of Tears, and then all of the other things. I think history, correct history, is very important.
It's important to remember a place like Amache because it's a place that reminds us of the balance between security and liberty. We are, as a nation, stand for liberty, but the liberty of the men and women and children who were placed in this camp was sacrificed in the name of national security. And those are questions which still haunt us today, questions that we still grope for the answers for.
Did we learn something from what happened to the Japanese Americans? I would hope so. Will it ever not happen again? I hope not, but can I say that for sure that it would never happen again? I can't say that. I'd like to say that.
My husband and I believe that it's what you teach your kids. You know, if you believe in education, you get them and get all the things, they will do okay.
If things like that are happening, we need to speak up, speak out, and do something.
And you cannot just ignore it, you know, you cannot.
They shouldn't feel badly about something that happened 70 years ago, my goodness. But they should remember so it doesn't happen again.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you. This episode is available on Blu-ray. Visit our website to order. There's more Colorado Experience online at rmpbs.org/Colorado Experience, Facebook and Twitter.